Leo Walker had spent most of his adult life living by simple rules. Work hard, mind your own business, and protect what is yours. After retiring early from a long, steady career as a mechanic, he finally realized his dream of moving into a quieter, slower-paced neighborhood just outside a small town in northern Georgia. The house was modest but solid, a traditional American one-story with a wide porch and an expansive front yard shaded by 2 towering maple trees that had likely stood there longer than the town itself. Leo loved the property from the moment he first saw it, not because it was flashy or grand, but because it felt real, tangible, a place he could finally call his own without interference or noise. The previous owners had let the place go a bit, and Leo spent his first months tackling one project at a time, sanding, painting, repairing, and slowly restoring both the house and the grounds to the kind of sturdy, proud condition it deserved. One of Leo's bigger projects, and the one he took the most pride in, was building a fence along the front perimeter of his property. Not one of those flimsy, prefab chain-link things either. No, Leo built it properly, with thick cedar planks, treated posts sunk deep into the earth, and wide enough gaps between the boards to maintain a friendly, open feel while still marking a clear, respectful boundary. It wasn't just for looks. The fence was practical too. The street he lived on was technically a dead end, but over the years it had become a favored shortcut for drivers from nearby neighborhoods looking to avoid the main road. Cars would come barreling down the street, cutting through without regard for children playing, pets wandering, or even just the peace of those living there. Leo's fence helped create a clear psychological line. Slow down, respect the space, you are entering someone's home. It didn't take long for most of the neighbors to appreciate Leo's work. Many of them had watched over the years as drivers treated the street like a racetrack, and though they hadn't taken action themselves, they were grateful someone finally had. Several people stopped by in the evenings to comment on the craftsmanship, offering beers, handshakes, and small compliments that Leo, a man uncomfortable with attention, accepted with a quiet nod and a thankful smile. It wasn't about showing off. It was about doing things right and doing them the way they should be done. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared that sentiment. One woman, in particular, made her discontent known almost immediately. Karen Bradley, who lived 2 houses down on the opposite side of the street, had a reputation for being loud, persistent, and unable to leave well enough alone. A large woman with a booming voice and a heavy, confrontational way of moving through the world, Karen seemed to thrive on manufacturing small dramas wherever she went. Leo had seen her in action before, harassing the mailman about delivery times, berating the teenage kid who mowed lawns in the summer for cutting crooked lines, cornering the trash collection workers to accuse them of mishandling her bins. He had known, in that quiet, heavy way people sometimes know things, that eventually she would turn her focus on him. And, sure enough, she did. The first encounter was, on the surface, civil enough. Karen approached him one Saturday morning while he was restaining the lower portion of the fence. She pulled up in her oversized SUV, the engine rumbling unnecessarily as she left it idling in the street, and got out with an exaggerated sigh. Leo looked up briefly, nodded in acknowledgement, and kept working. Not inviting conversation, but not openly hostile either. Karen wasted no time. "I don't know if you've thought about how that fence of yours is blocking visibility," she said loudly, standing with her arms crossed over her ample chest, casting a shadow across the freshly mown grass. "It's a hazard. You can't see around the corner anymore when you're pulling out." Leo paused, setting down his brush carefully. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt and turned to face her, polite but firm. "It's well within the setback limits," he said. "Cleared by the town inspector. I checked twice before building." Karen huffed, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "Well, maybe you followed the rules," she said, the way some people say rules like it's a dirty word. "But that doesn't make it safe. People have lived here for decades without a fence and no problems. Now suddenly it's like Fort Knox. You're going to cause an accident." Leo met her eyes evenly. "The street's straight for 50 yards in either direction. Nothing's blocked. Drivers just need to slow down, like they should have been doing all along." For a moment, Karen looked like she might escalate things right then and there, but something in Leo's steady, unbothered stance must have given her pause. Instead, she sniffed indignantly and said, "You'll see, people aren't going to put up with it." Then she got back into her SUV with some difficulty, slamming the door so hard the whole vehicle shuddered, and peeled off down the street faster than was remotely necessary. Leo watched her go, not with anger, but with a sort of detached inevitability. People like Karen didn't change. They just looked for new places to throw their weight around. Over the next couple of weeks, there were little signs that Karen was not done. At first, it was just the looks. Glares from across the street when Leo was out watering the garden, or thin, fake smiles when they passed each other on walks. Then it escalated. Leo noticed that some of the trash from Karen's property, large black bags that leaked and stank, had been moved closer and closer to his fence line each garbage day. He found flyers tucked under his windshield wipers warning about neighborhood safety hazards, clearly printed out at home with grainy clip art and passive-aggressive slogans about community cooperation. Once, Leo saw Karen standing at the corner of her driveway with a neighbor, gesturing animatedly toward his property, her arms waving in wide, exaggerated arcs. The neighbor looked uncomfortable and soon excused themselves. Still, Leo said nothing. Did nothing. He believed in picking his battles carefully, and a few tossed-off insults or childish pranks weren't enough to get him to lower himself to her level. His fence stood solid, a line not just of wood, but of quiet defiance. The real trouble started on an unusually warm afternoon in early fall. Leo was outside trimming back some of the hedges along the driveway, mindful of keeping everything tidy and neat, when he heard the now familiar rumble of Karen's SUV coming down the street. He barely glanced up. By now, he knew better than to expect anything good when she was near. But today felt different. The vehicle slowed as it approached his property, idling right at the edge of his yard. He straightened up, resting his gloved hands on the shears, and watched without moving as Karen threw the driver's side door open and heaved herself out of the car. She was red-faced, breathing heavily, and already yelling before she even closed the door. "You're a menace," she shouted, pointing one fat finger at him as she stomped across the sidewalk onto the grass. "I told you this would happen. I almost got hit just now because of that damn fence." Leo kept his expression neutral. "You almost got hit because you don't stop at intersections," he said simply. Karen's face twisted with fury. She took another step forward, her heavy footfalls flattening patches of Leo's carefully kept lawn. "This is going to end badly for you," she screamed. "Mark my words." And then, whether by rage or miscalculation, Karen pivoted back toward her vehicle, and in one clumsy, aggressive motion she slammed the SUV into reverse. The engine revved as she misjudged the distance, and with a sickening crack of wood and splintering sound, the rear bumper smashed directly into the corner post of Leo's fence, snapping it clean in two. For a moment, everything froze. Leo stared at the wrecked section of fence. Karen stared at the rearview mirror, wide-eyed and breathing heavily. Then, and this was the moment that truly crystallized everything about who Karen was, she threw open the door, stumbled out of the SUV, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. "He attacked me! He threatened me! I had to get away! It's his fault!" The words echoed off the houses, bouncing down the quiet suburban street, loud and shrill and utterly false. Leo did not move. He did not shout back. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed the non-emergency number for the local police department, calmly reporting a vehicular collision on his property, possible property damage, and a request for an officer to mediate. His voice never rose. His hands never shook. Because Leo Walker knew better than to fight fire with fire. Against people like Karen, the only real defense was the truth, patience and an unbreakable will to stand your ground. And so he stood there, silent and unblinking as the sirens began to wail faintly in the distance, growing louder, heading straight for them. The patrol car pulled up to the curb with a soft crunch of tires on gravel, its lights off, silent but imposing. Officer Bennett stepped out, a stocky man in his mid-40s with a steady, no-nonsense demeanor that immediately diffused the worst neighborhood squabbles just by his presence alone. He adjusted his belt, glanced once at Leo, then at Karen, who was still loudly proclaiming her innocence to the empty street, as if it were packed with spectators ready to applaud her performance. Officer Bennett approached with a clipboard tucked under his arm, his face neutral, the way seasoned officers mastered to avoid escalating petty situations. Leo stood next to the damaged section of his fence, hands behind his back, calm, waiting. He greeted the officer with a respectful nod but said nothing more, letting the facts speak for themselves. Karen, seeing an audience with authority, immediately launched into a dramatic retelling of the event, claiming she had been in fear for her life, that Leo had lunged toward her during a heated confrontation, and that she had no choice but to hastily retreat to protect herself, resulting in the unfortunate accident. Officer Bennett listened without interruption, taking sparse notes, his expression giving away nothing. When Karen finally ran out of steam, her breath heaving, he turned to Leo. "Sir, your side?" he asked simply. Leo described the encounter in brief, factual terms. The verbal confrontation, Karen's sudden reversal into the fence, and her immediate accusations afterward. He kept emotion out of his voice, speaking the way he always had when dealing with customers at his old garage. Firm, clear, and undeniably reasonable. Bennett looked between them, then down at the gouged earth where Karen's tires had torn across Leo's lawn, up at the broken fence post, still dangling at a cracked angle, and finally at the heavy SUV, its bumpers smeared with scuffed cedar wood and splinters. It didn't take a detective to piece it together. Nevertheless, procedure had to be followed. He informed both parties that a report would be filed documenting the incident as a property damage case. No charges would be laid immediately, but Karen was free to pursue a civil claim if she felt injured, and Leo likewise was entitled to pursue compensation for the damage. Officer Bennett handed each of them a carbon copy of the incident report, advised them to avoid further direct contact, and left with the kind of weary resignation of a man who knew he'd be writing this one up for the chief later with the note. "Neighbor dispute, ongoing," scrawled in the margin. Karen glared at Leo as she backed her SUV away from the ruined fence, jerking the wheel as if daring him to step into her path. He didn't move. He watched her drive off with the slow inevitability of a passing storm, then turned back to the broken fence, crouching to examine the damage. The post was shattered beyond easy repair. The ground had been gouged deep where her tires had spun. It would take more than just a hammer and nails to set it right again. Leo made a mental note to check if he had enough lumber left in the shed, already tallying the cost in his mind, and resolved to document everything with photographs before touching a thing. By the time he finished taking the photos and writing down a few notes for his own records, the sun was beginning to dip behind the line of trees that framed the street in gold and shadow. Leo stood there a moment longer, the camera heavy in his hand, feeling the first real stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. A slow, building anger, not the hot flash of rage, but a cold, persistent burn in the chest. The kind that said, quietly but with absolute certainty, this was not going to end here. The next day, Leo began receiving letters. At first, they were small things. Folded notes without return addresses, slipped into his mailbox or tucked under his porch mat, each one written in the same clumsy, all-caps handwriting. They accused him of being a danger to the neighborhood, of harassing respectable women, of building illegal structures. Leo read them without reacting, stacking them neatly in a drawer in the kitchen without a word. He knew better than to engage. He had lived long enough to understand that people like Karen didn't thrive on fairness or truth. They thrived on attention and reaction. Starving them of both was often the only way to win, but the notes were only the beginning. 2 days after the incident, Leo received a formal notice from the local zoning board informing him that a complaint had been filed regarding his fence. The complaint alleged that the structure was built in violation of setback ordinances, obstructed sight lines for drivers, and posed a safety hazard. The language was clinical, but the intent was clear. Leo knew who was behind it before he even finished reading. He sat at the kitchen table for a long while after that, the letter unfolded before him, his cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. He weighed his options carefully. He could ignore it and hope it blew over, but Leo wasn't a man to leave threats unchallenged on principle, nor was he foolish enough to think that silence would protect him. If Karen was willing to invent accusations of physical threat and manipulate the system to her advantage, she would not stop until she had what she wanted. And what she wanted, Leo understood now, was not just a change to his fence or an apology. She wanted dominance. She wanted to win. So he made his decision. That afternoon, Leo drove to the office of Michael Thurston, a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. Michael was a no-frills type, known for his bluntness and his effectiveness in court. And more importantly, he had no patience for frivolous claims or manipulative plaintiffs. Leo explained the situation plainly, handing over copies of the police report, photographs of the fence, the official building permits he had secured before construction, and now the zoning complaint. Michael read through the documents, his brow furrowing slightly. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers against the edge of his desk. "She's playing a long game," he said finally. "Death by 1,000 cuts. Complaints, accusations, procedural harassment. She's betting you'll get tired, make a mistake, or spend yourself into the ground fighting her." Leo nodded slowly. "I'm not planning to get tired." Michael smiled thinly. "Good, because she picked the wrong guy if that's the case. Here's what we do. You document everything, and I mean everything. Every note, every conversation, every repair you have to make. We respond formally to the zoning board with proof that your fence meets all legal requirements. If she escalates, and she will, we file for injunctive relief against her harassment." Leo left the office lighter than he had come in. Not happy. The situation still sat in his gut like a stone. But armed. Prepared. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't without options. The days that followed were marked by small but deliberate provocations. Leo would come outside in the morning to find dead leaves dumped along the inside of his fence, far too many and too neatly piled to be the result of simple wind. Trash bins would mysteriously tip over near his driveway, their contents spilled onto his sidewalk, always, somehow, when he wasn't looking. One morning, he found that someone had unscrewed 2 of the solar lights he had placed along the walkway and left them smashed on the ground. Each incident was minor, almost laughable in isolation, but taken together, they formed a pattern that was as clear as it was exhausting. And through it all, Karen lurked in the background. She never approached directly again, not after the police report and Leo's steadfast refusal to engage. But he would catch glimpses of her, standing in her driveway, arms folded, staring openly as he repaired the fence she had damaged. Sitting in her SUV at the corner of the block, engine idling as he mowed the lawn, walking her dog painfully slowly. Past his property, pausing a little too long by his mailbox. She was there, always, a looming presence just out of reach but never out of mind. When the zoning board finally scheduled the official inspection to review the complaint, Leo was ready. He had already contacted his own independent surveyor to confirm the property lines and had a copy of the original town permit in a waterproof folder. He stood by calmly as the town inspector measured distances, checked sight lines, and reviewed his paperwork. Karen appeared halfway through the process, standing across the street with her arms crossed and an ugly smirk on her face, as if she were already celebrating a victory she believed inevitable. But the inspector found no violations. The fence was within legal limits, did not obstruct the required clear zone for driver visibility, and had been properly permitted and recorded. When he finished his review, he shook Leo's hand, made a few polite comments about the quality of the construction, and said that the board would be informed that the complaint was without merit. Karen's face fell when she saw the handshake. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her house without a word. Leo watched her go, his expression unreadable. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. People like Karen didn't stop when they lost. They doubled down. And somewhere deep inside, Leo Walker understood that the real fight had only just begun. The following weeks unfolded with the slow, grinding inevitability of a landslide. Small pebbles at first, but gathering speed and mass with each passing day. Leo Walker, who had thought that securing a clean inspection and dismissing the zoning complaint would settle matters, quickly realized he had underestimated just how persistent and how petty Karen Bradley could be when she sensed her power, slipping away. The first sign came one morning when Leo found a new set of posters taped to the community bulletin board near the neighborhood park, just a few blocks from his house. Printed in large, screaming fonts and littered with ominous clip art of wrecked cars and warning signs, the posters accused irresponsible residents of endangering public safety by erecting unlawful barriers and reducing vital visibility at intersections. The posters did not mention Leo by name, but they didn't have to. The implication was as clear as the freshly glued paper. Leo stood there for a long moment, reading every word without expression, then methodically peeled one of the posters down and folded it into his jacket. He made a quiet note to mention it to Michael Thurston, though he already knew the advice he would get. Document, document, document. Proving slander or libel was difficult, especially when accusations were vague and phrased as opinion rather than direct statements of fact. Still, Leo knew it wasn't about winning every battle. It was about standing tall enough that Karen and her kind could not pretend the world bent around them. The situation escalated from words to actions not long after. On a windy Friday afternoon, Leo came home from running errands to find a city maintenance crew parked in front of his house. 3 men in reflective vests were standing near the fence, rolling a measuring tape along the sidewalk and muttering to each other. When Leo approached, politely asking if there was an issue, one of them, a wiry, sunburned man with a clipboard, explained they were there to assess a citizen-initiated safety concern regarding visibility and obstruction. Leo didn't argue. Instead, he retrieved his permits, the zoning clearance, and the independent surveyor's report from inside the house and presented them calmly. The crew chief glanced over the documents, frowned slightly, then shrugged and said they would note the compliance in their report, but had to complete the inspection anyway because once a call is made, we're obligated to follow through. Leo nodded, thanked them for their time, and watched silently as they finished their redundant task. Karen, of course, was watching too, sitting on her front porch with a large plastic cup of iced tea, pretending to chat on the phone but stealing frequent, not-so-subtle glances toward his property. That evening, Leo made another visit to Michael's office, stacking up the latest events into a growing pile of documented harassment. Michael listened without interrupting, scribbling occasional notes. When Leo finished, Michael leaned back and said, "This is the second stage. She's trying to pressure you indirectly now. Public opinion, bureaucratic interference, death by inconvenience. She figures if enough agencies keep showing up, you'll either cave or slip up somewhere." Leo nodded once. "I'm not slipping." Michael smiled grimly. "Good. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. I'll draft a cease and desist letter. It won't stop her, but it'll lay a foundation if we have to escalate this into a formal harassment claim later." True to form, Karen did not slow down. The flyers multiplied, appearing not just on public boards but tucked under windshield wipers at the grocery store, pinned to telephone poles, and even slipped into neighbors' mailboxes. An illegal act, but difficult to trace directly back to her, without catching her in the act. Leo maintained his routine with stoic determination. Every morning, he walked the perimeter of his property, inspecting for new damage or litter, documenting anything unusual with date-stamped photographs. Every evening, he updated a running log, recording each suspicious incident, each city inspection, each passive-aggressive interaction with Karen or her proxies. The neighborhood atmosphere grew heavier by the week. People Leo barely knew now gave him cautious, sideways glances when he passed by. Conversations with friendly acquaintances grew shorter, stiffer, punctuated by awkward silences and polite exits. Karen's campaign of innuendo and fear-mongering was working, at least among those who preferred to believe the loudest voice rather than verify the facts themselves. It didn't matter that Leo had all the documentation. In the court of public opinion, emotion often outweighed evidence. The first real act of sabotage came on a stormy Saturday night. Heavy rain had lashed the town for hours, the gutters overflowing, the streets shimmering under a restless, battering wind. Leo was inside, reading in his den, when he heard the sharp crack of wood splitting outside, distinct even over the roar of the storm. Heart pounding but steady, he grabbed his jacket and flashlight and stepped out into the torrent. The beam of his flashlight cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating the familiar lines of his fence. Except now, one section near the corner was down, the posts sheared at an unnatural angle, as if struck by something heavy. Leo moved closer, the mud sucking at his boots, and found tire tracks, deep, fresh gouges slicing through the soft earth, leading straight to the break in the fence. A vehicle, heavy, likely Karen's oversized SUV, had rammed it under cover of the storm, relying on the chaos and the low visibility to mask her act of destruction. Leo did not rage. He did not shout into the night. Instead, he methodically photographed everything: the tracks, the brake, the angle of impact, the debris scattered into the street. Then he called the police once again and filed another report, calm and professional, describing the likely suspect but without accusations he could not yet prove. Officer Bennett was the one who responded again. He looked weary as he took down the information, nodding slightly as Leo laid out the facts. "She's pushing," Bennett said quietly as he tucked the report into his folder. "Hoping you'll lash out. Hoping you'll give her something she can use." Leo nodded once, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. "I'm not giving her anything." Bennett gave him a long, measuring look, then said, "If it were me, I'd start thinking about getting cameras up. Good ones. Cover your whole property. Not to catch her, but to protect yourself. People like this, they escalate." Leo took that advice seriously. The next morning, between cleaning up the wreckage of his fence and cataloging the latest batch of Karen's passive-aggressive flyers scattered in his yard, he ordered a full set of weatherproof security cameras, mounted high and angled carefully to avoid accusations of invasion of privacy while still providing a clear record of any trespass or vandalism. Within 3 days, they were operational, silently watching, silently recording. And still the provocations continued. Someone, Leo didn't bother to guess who anymore, dumped a bucket of nails across his driveway one night. Small twisted metal pieces that could have caused serious damage if he hadn't spotted the glint of them in the early morning light. Twice he found graffiti scrawled on the sidewalk in front of his house, messages warning him to tear it down or move away. Each time he documented, cleaned up, and carried on, relentless as the tide. Karen's strategy shifted again after the second fence incident failed to provoke him. This time, she took her complaints higher, filing a formal grievance with the town council, claiming that Leo's fence was part of a systematic campaign of intimidation against her and other vulnerable members of the community. Her letter to the council was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, full of vague references to feeling unsafe and targeted, careful not to accuse Leo of anything criminal, but painting a portrait of him as a lurking, dangerous figure poisoning the neighborhood. When Leo received notice of the council meeting where the grievance would be discussed, he felt the old stirrings of anger rise again, but he tamped them down. Michael Thurston prepared a formal rebuttal, complete with copies of the inspection reports, police reports, and photographic evidence. Leo himself drafted a short, respectful letter to the council, outlining the timeline of events and reaffirming his commitment to maintaining his property within all legal and ethical standards. On the night of the council meeting, Leo sat quietly in the back of the small municipal hall, wearing his cleanest work shirt and jeans, listening as Karen stood at the podium, trembling with fake emotion as she spoke about how her once safe street had been turned into a battleground. He watched the faces of the council members as they listened, some skeptical, some wary, a few clearly wondering how much political trouble could be caused by siding one way or the other. When it came time for Leo's response, he didn't match Karen's theatrics. He stood, walked calmly to the podium, and spoke in a low, measured voice. He laid out the facts. He did not attack Karen's character. He did not plead for sympathy. He presented reality, plain and unvarnished. In the end, the council declined to take action against him, citing lack of evidence of wrongdoing and expressing concern over the pattern of baseless complaints. Karen's face twisted with rage as the decision was read aloud. She stormed from the room without waiting for adjournment, the door slamming behind her like a gunshot. Leo sat for a moment longer before standing and leaving as well, his heart steady, his mind clear. He knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he also knew something even more important. He would not be the one to break first. Leo Walker had never been a man to underestimate his opponents, but as autumn deepened and the days shortened, he began to understand that Karen Bradley's obsession with controlling their neighborhood went beyond petty grievances or bruised pride. It had become personal, a vendetta fueled not by any real harm he had caused but by her inability to dominate and dictate as she had so easily done with others. Leo recognized the pattern, the way she shifted tactics when one method failed, always probing for a new angle of attack, always testing the boundaries of what she could get away with. And so he adapted in turn, moving with quiet, methodical precision, reinforcing his defenses not with anger or retaliation, but with patience and evidence. By late October, the evidence was mounting. The security cameras had captured a series of minor but telling incidents. A figure resembling Karen tossing a bag of rotting garbage over his fence in the early hours before dawn. A shadowy figure scraping a key along the side of his truck. Someone scattering broken glass across his driveway under cover of darkness. None of the footage showed faces clearly enough for criminal charges, but it formed a mosaic, a steady drumbeat of harassment that would be difficult for any reasonable person to dismiss. Leo cataloged each incident meticulously, creating a timeline so detailed it could have belonged to a detective's case file rather than an aging mechanic simply trying to live in peace. It was Michael Thurston who suggested the next move. Reviewing the growing pile of documentation in his cluttered office one rainy afternoon, the attorney leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers thoughtfully. "We have enough to file for a protective order," he said. "It won't stop her from mouthing off, but it would legally bar her from coming within a certain distance of your property or communicating with you directly. It also gives us a stronger basis to sue for harassment damages if she keeps it up." Leo considered it, his face as unreadable as ever. He hated the idea of escalating through courts and lawyers, hated the idea that he had to involve the system to defend what should have been common decency. But he also understood the necessity. Karen was not going to stop because it was the right thing to do. She would only stop when it became more costly for her to continue than to retreat. "Do it," Leo said simply, and that evening, Michael began drafting the paperwork. The news seemed to reach Karen before the ink was even dry. Perhaps she had connections at the courthouse, or perhaps she simply sensed the shift in the air, but her behavior changed almost immediately. No longer content with backdoor attacks, she began openly confronting Leo again, shouting across the street, accusing him of ruining the neighborhood, of creating a hostile environment, her voice carrying across the cold, brittle autumn air like the call of some wounded animal. Leo never responded. He knew that was exactly what she wanted, a reaction that she could twist and magnify. He simply turned and walked away each time, letting her words fall uselessly into the empty space between them. It was during this tense stalemate that the unexpected happened, the event that would shift the balance in ways even Leo could not have predicted. A city safety inspector, assigned to perform random compliance checks across various neighborhoods, happened to pass through Leo's street. Noticing the proliferation of warning posters and the number of community complaints filed, most of which he later discovered traced back to Karen herself, the inspector decided to conduct a fresh evaluation of the street's layout, traffic, patterns, and visibility. Leo wasn't even aware it was happening until the inspector, a tall, weathered man named Harris, knocked on his door one crisp morning, politely explaining his purpose and asking if he could review the sightlines around the property. Leo agreed at once, providing his permits and offering to move his truck if it obstructed any views. Harris waved off the offer, saying he preferred to assess it under normal conditions. For over an hour, he walked the length of the street, took measurements, snapped photos, and jotted notes, occasionally nodding to himself thoughtfully but offering no immediate conclusions. It wasn't until a week later that Leo received a copy of the inspector's findings, and the contents made him sit back in his chair, a slow smile of grim satisfaction touching his lips for the first time in months. Not only did Harris conclude that Leo's fence was fully compliant with all applicable ordinances, but he also noted that the presence of the fence had actually improved safety along the street. By providing a clear visual boundary and discouraging drivers from cutting across the corner, the fence had forced vehicles to slow down and exercise greater caution, effectively reducing speeding incidents by a measurable margin. In his formal recommendation to the council, Harris suggested installing additional signage reinforcing speed limits and even praised Leo's proactive contribution to community safety. Leo immediately forwarded a copy of the report to Michael Thurston, who wasted no time incorporating it into the filing for the protective order. It was a decisive blow, a piece of hard, professional evidence that directly contradicted Karen's narrative and painted her complaints not as concerns for public welfare, but as baseless harassment. Leo knew Karen would hear of it soon enough. Small towns had their own strange, efficient ways of transmitting news, faster and more reliably than any official bulletin. Sure enough, the change in Karen's behavior was immediate and visible. She no longer shouted from across the street. She no longer loitered near his property or glared at him from her driveway. Instead, she withdrew, stewing behind closed doors, occasionally peering out through parted curtains with a face twisted by bitterness and defeat. Leo did not gloat. He knew better than to believe the fight was truly over. People like Karen did not accept losses easily. They brooded. They schemed. But he also knew that the tide had turned, that her power to act without consequence was slipping through her fingers. For the first time in months, Leo allowed himself a small measure of peace. He repaired the damaged sections of the fence with fresh wood, taking his time to match the grain and stain perfectly. He cleaned up his yard, reseeded the patches of grass torn up by tire tracks, reinstalled the solar lights destroyed by petty vandals. Life began, slowly, to return to normal. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began to nod to him again, tentative but genuine, as if reassessing the stories they had been fed and finding them wanting. Leo made no speeches. He hosted no parties. He simply lived each quiet act of maintenance and restoration, a quiet affirmation that he would not be moved from his rightful place. And though the cameras continued to hum softly from their hidden perches, and though he still locked his gate each night and kept careful records of every unusual occurrence, Leo knew, deep down, that the worst was behind him. At least for now. The middle of the battle had passed. The field was bloodied, scarred by months of tension and malice, but Leo Walker remained standing, intact, unbowed, and in the growing cold of the year's final months, that was enough. If Leo Walker had dared to hope that the official inspection report and the growing silence from Karen Bradley signaled the true end of her campaign against him, those hopes were short-lived. Silence, after all, was often just the surface of deeper waters, and Karen, as Leo had come to understand all too well, was not the sort of person to let go of a grievance without a final, desperate act. The first sign came subtly. An envelope appeared in Leo's mailbox, not from the city council or any of the usual bureaucratic channels, but from a private attorney's office Leo had never heard of, located 2 towns over. Inside was a neatly printed letter informing him that Karen Bradley had filed a civil suit against him, claiming emotional distress, property damage to her vehicle resulting from dangerous obstructions placed negligently near the public thoroughfare, and an ongoing campaign of harassment that had caused her severe psychological trauma and loss of community standing. Leo read the letter twice, not out of confusion, but to ensure he hadn't missed some absurd detail that would make the entire thing collapse under its own weight. But no, it was written with just enough vague, manipulative language to force a legal response. Karen wasn't trying to win a case. She was trying to bleed him, in time, in money, and in energy, hoping he would settle, concede, or finally snap. Leo folded the letter carefully, placed it on the kitchen table, and called Michael Thurston. Michael, for his part, was not surprised. He explained that this tactic was known among attorneys as a nuisance suit, designed less to prevail in court and more to burden the defendant into submission through the sheer cost of defending themselves. "She's counting on you wanting to avoid the hassle," Michael said as he leafed through the packet Leo had dropped off at his office later that day. "But this is good news in a way. Filing this makes her vulnerable. She has to prove her claims now, not just shout them into the wind." Leo nodded. "Then let's make her prove every word." Preparation for the court battle consumed the following weeks. Michael gathered depositions, requested security footage, compiled the inspection reports, and secured witness statements from several neighbors who had seen or experienced Karen's more aggressive tactics firsthand. Leo, for his part, remained steadfast, providing every document, every dated photo, every log entry he had maintained during the long siege. He understood that courts didn't reward emotion, they rewarded evidence, and he had plenty of it. The day of the first court hearing arrived under a sky the color of wet cement. The small county courthouse was unremarkable. A squat brick building surrounded by half-empty parking lots and a scattering of old oak trees shedding their last brittle leaves. Leo sat quietly at the defendant's table in a plain gray suit, his hands folded loosely in front of him, radiating a calm that belied the slow thrum of tension in his chest. Across the aisle, Karen sat with her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman with an air of manufactured indignation. Karen herself had dressed for maximum sympathy. A conservative blouse, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression carefully arranged into one of wounded vulnerability. The proceedings began with Karen's lawyer launching into a sweeping condemnation of Leo's supposed campaign of terror. She painted a picture of a vulnerable woman besieged by a hostile neighbor, a man whose unprovoked aggression had forced her to live in constant fear for her safety and well-being. She cited Karen's medical records, conveniently highlighting a diagnosis of stress-induced hypertension, and claimed damages not just for her physical health but for her reputation in the community. Leo listened without flinching, his face giving away nothing. When it came time for Michael to respond, the attorney rose with the quiet assurance of a man who knew he held the stronger hand. Piece by piece, he dismantled Karen's narrative, introducing into evidence the multiple police reports filed by Leo, the footage showing Karen littering and vandalizing the property, the independent safety inspection report, and the testimony of the city inspector praising Leo's contribution to neighborhood safety. Michael spoke in an even, steady tone, never attacking Karen personally, simply letting the facts grind her carefully constructed facade into dust. The highlight came when one of the neighbors, a retired firefighter named Glenn Parker, took the stand. Glenn, a no-nonsense man with a deep voice and a reputation for blunt honesty, testified that he had seen Karen back her SUV into Leo's fence during their initial confrontation, then immediately begin shouting false accusations. He also confirmed seeing her distribute flyers and observed her staring down Leo from across the street on multiple occasions, behavior that he described succinctly as targeted harassment. Karen's lawyer objected several times, but the judge, E.D., sharp-eyed woman who had clearly seen her share of neighborhood feuds spiral into courtrooms, overruled most of the protests. When cross-examined, Glenn held firm, his answers brief but devastatingly consistent. By the time he stepped down, the momentum of the case had shifted palpably in Leo's favor. During a recess, Leo stood outside the courthouse steps, watching a cluster of brown leaves whirl in the cold wind. Karen stood across the plaza, her face flushed and pinched with rage as she argued fiercely with her lawyer. Leo caught snippets of the conversation, the words witness tampering and bias floating across the open air, hollow and desperate. He turned away without a word, hands deep in his coat pockets, knowing better than to savor a victory too soon. The second phase of the hearing saw Karen herself take the stand, a decision that Michael had privately predicted would be her undoing. Under direct examination from her lawyer, she maintained her composure, reciting rehearsed stories of fear and distress. But under Michael's cross-examination, cracks began to appear. Asked to specify dates, times, and witnesses to Leo's supposed threats, Karen stumbled. Shown video evidence contradicting her claims, she hedged, growing defensive and petulant. Pressed about the repeated false complaints filed with the city, she lashed out, accusing the entire neighborhood of conspiracy against her. By the time Michael finished, Karen's case had unraveled so thoroughly that even her lawyer seemed to wilt under the weight of it. The judge called for closing arguments, but her tone suggested that she had already reached her own conclusions. A week later, the formal ruling was issued. The court found in favor of Leo Walker, dismissing Karen's claims in their entirety and ordering her to pay a portion of his legal fees. Additionally, the judge granted Leo's petition for a protective order, restricting Karen from any further direct or indirect contact and prohibiting her from approaching within 100 feet of his property. When Leo read the judgment, he felt no great rush of triumph, just a deep, quiet satisfaction, like the sound of a heavy door closing gently, finally locking out a long, cold wind. He knew Karen wouldn't disappear overnight. People like her never did. But now she was contained, legally fenced in just as surely as his property was by the sturdy cedar planks he had sunk deep into the earth. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its slow, steady rhythm. Karen retreated into sullen obscurity, rarely seen outside her house except for occasional furtive trips to the grocery store or brief appearances at the mailbox. The neighbors, once wary and distant, grew warmer. Some stopped to chat as Leo worked in his yard, expressing quiet admiration for how he had handled himself. A few even apologized, embarrassed at how quickly they had believed the worst. Leo accepted their words with a nod and a small smile, neither bitter nor boastful. Winter came early that year, a brittle, dry cold that frosted the edges of the fence and laid a thin sheen of ice over the cracked sidewalks. Leo spent his days splitting firewood, repairing small things around the house, and walking the perimeter each evening as the light faded from the sky, a quiet guardian over his little patch of earth. The battle was over, but Leo Walker remained vigilant, knowing that peace was not a gift, but a discipline, something won not through grand gestures but through the simple, stubborn refusal to be driven away from what was rightfully his, and he intended to keep it that way. The first heavy snow of the season fell in early December, blanketing the quiet neighborhood in a soft, deceptive calm that muted every sound and softened every harsh edge. Leo Walker stood on his porch in the pale morning light, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching as the world around him settled under a clean white sheet. For a moment, it almost seemed as if the last bitter months had been nothing but a bad dream, as if the hostility, the lawsuits, and the endless provocations had all melted away with the arrival of winter. But Leo knew better. He had learned the hard way that some threats did not vanish. They simply went to ground, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness. And sure enough, when his breath hung in the cold air and the day stretched silent before him, the next move came. Quiet, almost invisible at first, but unmistakable to a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read the signs. It began with a subtle change in the way the neighbors moved. Conversations at the mailbox grew shorter. A few turned their eyes away when passing his house. Small gatherings formed at the far end of the block, heads bowed together, glances thrown furtively in his direction. Leo noticed, but said nothing, responding only with the same steady nods and small smiles that had become his armor. Then, late one evening, an anonymous letter appeared, tucked neatly under his windshield wiper at the grocery store. The letter was short and unsigned, but its message was clear. You might have won the battle, but you don't belong here. Leo read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, next to the worn leather wallet that carried his few personal papers. It wasn't the letter itself that troubled him. Cowardly threats written by unseen hands had no power over a man who had faced far greater dangers in his lifetime. But the realization that Karen's defeat had not quenched her bitterness. Instead, it had festered, poisoned the minds of those she could still influence, spreading a quiet, insidious resentment that no court ruling could erase. A week later, under cover of another snowfall, someone sabotaged Leo's property again. This time it was the gutter downspouts along the side of his house, carefully loosened so that melting snow would flood the foundation instead of draining away. Leo discovered it early, before any real damage could occur, and repaired it himself without calling attention to the act. He installed additional cameras afterward, placing them higher with wider angles, their lenses dark and watchful against the gray sky. The message was simple. I see you. I will not be driven out. But the true culmination came one frigid night just before Christmas. Leo was returning from a late trip to the hardware store, having picked up supplies for a project he intended to work on through the holidays. As he turned onto his street, the headlights of his truck swept across a strange scene unfolding at the edge of his property. 3 figures stood in the darkness, bundled against the cold, working quickly at the base of his fence with tools that glittered dully under the frost-heavy air. Leo slowed the truck to a crawl, pulling to the side without turning off the engine, watching through the windshield with a measured, clinical calm. He recognized Karen immediately, her bulk unmistakable even under layers of winter clothing, and, with her, 2 young men he had seen coming and going from her house in recent weeks, likely relatives or hangers-on. Leo did not rush out shouting or brandishing accusations. He simply shifted the truck into park, clicked on the floodlights he had installed earlier that fall, and bathed the entire scene in a harsh, unrelenting white glare. The effect was immediate. The 2 young men froze, tools half raised, while Karen turned. Blinking against the sudden brightness, her face contorted into a mask of fury and frustration. Leo remained inside the cab of the truck, one hand resting lightly on the dashboard, the other holding his phone already cued to dial the non-emergency police line. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then, with a hiss of angry breath visible in the cold air, Karen barked something at the boys and they scattered, trudging away across the street toward her house, leaving behind a half-finished attempt to pry loose several fence boards. Karen followed a moment later, turning once to glare at Leo with a look so venomous it seemed almost to shatter the stillness of the night. Leo watched her go, then calmly placed the call to Officer Bennett, reporting an attempted trespass and vandalism in progress, supplying footage from his live feed cameras even as he spoke. When the patrol car arrived 20 minutes later, Karen was nowhere to be found, having retreated into her house and shut off all her exterior lights. But the evidence remained. Pry marks on the fence boards, dropped tools with Karen's fingerprints later confirmed by the responding officer, and Leo's crystal-clear security footage showing the act itself. Officer Bennett took the report with grim efficiency, his mouth set in a hard line. "This isn't just neighbor trouble anymore," he said as he wrapped up the paperwork. "This is criminal." Within 48 hours, charges were filed: attempted vandalism, conspiracy to commit property damage, and violation of the protective order previously granted by the court. Karen was served the papers publicly, her furious protests echoing down the street as officers handed her the summons at her front door. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and half-open blinds, the silent witnesses to the final unraveling of a campaign built on lies, malice, and pride. Leo did not celebrate. He did not gloat. Instead, he shoveled the snow from his walk that afternoon with slow, steady strokes, the cold biting into his hands but not into his heart. When a few of the braver neighbors ventured out, offering tentative greetings and awkward smiles, he returned them politely but without warmth. Trust, he knew, was not so easily rebuilt. Some scars ran deeper than others. Karen's trial date was set for early spring, but even before then, the reality of her defeat had settled over the block like another layer of snow. Heavy, muffling, undeniable. She put her house up for sale quietly in late January, the real estate sign appearing overnight as if she hoped no one would notice the final surrender. Leo noticed. Everyone noticed. But no one said a word. As the winter dragged on and the days began their slow, stubborn climb back toward the light, Leo Walker found a new rhythm in the silence. The fence stood firm and proud against the wind, a testament to endurance not just of wood and nails, but of spirit. His steps grew lighter, his breaths easier, the burden of constant vigilance easing at last into something closer to peace. The war was over, the battlefield abandoned, and Leo Walker remained, steadfast, unbroken, the quiet heart of a neighborhood that had learned at great cost that some lines were not drawn in chalk but carved in stone. The first true signs of spring arrived like a quiet truce after a long, bitter war. Snow retreated from the edges of Leo Walker's lawn, revealing patches of stubborn green grass pushing through the thawing ground. The cold, sharp wind softened into something gentler, carrying with it the clean scent of rain and the faint, tentative chirping of birds returning to old perches. Life, it seemed, was slowly stitching itself back together in the little neighborhood where for too many months tension had poisoned the air and suspicion had grown like a weed between once friendly houses. And through it all, Leo remained a fixed point, unchanging, solid, the way a mountain endures even when the rivers around it shift their course. Karen Bradley's house stood silent and abandoned now, the windows dark, the mailbox taped shut with a bright orange sticker indicating the property was pending foreclosure after her hurried, disastrous attempt to sell it fell apart. Rumors floated up and down the street like dandelion seeds, whispers of unpaid debts, liens, and quiet investigations into various acts of harassment stretching far beyond just Leo's experience. But Leo paid the gossip no mind. Karen was gone, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale, a fading ghost in a neighborhood eager to forget its own complicity. He had no interest in vindication parades or hollow apologies. His victory had never been about public approval. It was about something far older and harder to define. The simple, sacred right to live in peace on ground he had worked for and defended with patience and quiet strength. The new owners of Karen's house moved in quietly, a young couple with cautious smiles and a battered pickup truck full of second-hand furniture. Leo watched them from his porch one morning as they struggled to wrestle a sagging mattress through the narrow front door, the woman laughing breathlessly, The man swearing under his breath but smiling all the same. They were ordinary, unremarkable in the best possible way, and Leo felt a small weight lift from his chest as he stood and ambled down the sidewalk to offer a hand. They accepted gratefully, their thanks genuine and uncolored by fear or suspicion. For the first time in a long while, Leo shook a neighbor's hand without wondering what lies they might have heard or what hidden judgments they might carry. The days grew longer, the light lingering into evenings that smelled of fresh earth and wood smoke. Leo threw himself into the work that had always grounded him, repairing the last few storm-battered fence posts, reseeding patches of lawn, oiling the hinges on the gate so it swung smooth and silent once more. The small tasks accumulated into something larger, something durable and real. At night, he would sit on his porch with a cup of strong coffee, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog, feeling the slow, steady heartbeat of a neighborhood returning to itself. There were still reminders, of course, faint tire tracks cut into the softer parts of the lawn from those nights of sabotage, a faint discoloration on the side of the house where someone had once thrown something they shouldn't have. The scars did not vanish simply because the danger had passed, but Leo accepted them the way a soldier accepts old wounds, not with bitterness, but with the quiet understanding that survival always leaves its mark. They were part of the landscape now just as much as the fence, the trees, and the cracked sidewalk winding lazily past his property. Neighbors who had once avoided him now offered cautious waves and brief conversations about weather, lawn care, and minor repairs. No one brought up the past directly. No one apologized openly. But there was a weight to their words, a hesitance that spoke volumes. They were grateful in the way people often are when someone else fights the battle they were too afraid or too weary to face themselves. Leo bore them no grudge. Courage could not be demanded any more than loyalty could be bought. It was enough that they now understood the value of the quiet man with the stubborn heart and the unbreakable fence. In the early days of May, as the first true warmth soaked into the soil and the trees exploded into fresh green, Leo held a small gathering. It wasn't a party. Leo Walker was not a man for celebrations, but rather a simple cookout, an open invitation sent to the nearest neighbors. He set up a battered grill on his driveway, grilled hamburgers and hot dogs, put out a cooler of drinks, and let the smells and sounds of ordinary life roll across the street. People came, shy at first, then easing into casual conversation as the sun dipped lower and the first stars blinked awake in the wide evening sky. Children ran laughing between the parked cars. Old men compared lawnmower brands. Women swapped recipes and complained about the price of groceries. Leo moved among them quietly, his presence steady and reassuring, the living embodiment of the idea that not every wrong needed to be shouted down with rage or avenged with violence. Sometimes it was enough simply to endure, to stand firm against the tide, and in doing so to become something greater than the sum of 1,000 small indignities. Strength not as a weapon, but as a foundation. As the night wound down and neighbors drifted back to their homes, full and a little lighter in spirit, Leo remained on the porch a little longer, sipping the last of his coffee as the darkness deepened around him. The cameras were still in place, their tiny indicator lights blinking steadily against the shadows. The fence still stood, repaired and stronger than ever, every plank and post a testament to the battles fought and won. And Leo Walker sat silently, breathing in the cool night air, content not because everything was perfect, but because it was real, earned, defended. In the end, peace was not something given freely. It was something claimed, built board by board, defended minute by minute, and valued because of the price paid for it. And as the wind whispered through the branches above him and the stars turned slowly overhead, Leo knew that whatever came tomorrow, whatever new storms might one day gather, he was ready. This was his home, his ground, his victory, and no one would ever take it from him again.